So what we do on Let Us Explain is dive deep on something that we can't stop thinking about for other people who can't stop thinking about that thing too. That means we'll be talking about anything and everything. Sometimes that includes spoilers. But before we jump into the spoiler zone, let's talk more generally about Watchmen. I am your co-host, Zachary Shevich, and joining me, he's a worthy adversary. It's Arturo Zurita!
I am so excited to go to Sundance this year to see the President of the United States there. He keeps saying he's retiring.
In chief.
Who would have thought Robert Redford would have made a President of the United States of America?
I mean, a cowboy actor becoming president.
Yeah, exactly.
Ridiculous.
I'm excited to talk about this show, mainly because I'm excited to talk about it with you. This man will not shut up about this show. This man was talking about seeing every episode 3 times before it even came to the finale. He has been saving a lot of his theories, a lot of the talk for this episode right here. And I've been saving a lot of the, what's it called? Devil's advocate for this. So we're about to have a good discussion here.
You've got some qualms. You've got some criticisms.
I got a little things.
We'll see where that takes us because this is a really interesting show. There's a lot to talk about. Watchmen is the recently concluded HBO series based off of the graphic novel of the same name by Alan Moore. Moore's story, originally published in 1986 and 1987, was a deconstruction of the superhero concept, depicting an alternate history in which superheroes are commonplace, including helping the U.S. Army win the Vietnam War and stopping Watergate, etc. The new show, led by Lost and The Leftovers showrunner Damon Lindelof, expands on this idea, envisioning a 2019 alternate history set after the 1985 alternate history of Moore's comics. Art, I'd like to start by reading you a quote from Angelica Jade Bastien's interview with Damon Lindelof from Vulture. I recommend reading it if you're interested in this show.
Okay.
I'm quoting Lindelof here. Quote, I was vehemently shouting at the top of my lungs, we are not doing Watchmen babies. I don't want everyone on the show to be related to someone from the original Watchmen. It's so predictable and so obvious, and we're not doing it. Lo and behold, it felt like the story Gravity. It's the same conversations around Star Wars right now. Is it cooler that Rey is not related to anybody from Star Wars, or does the story demand that she is? Because when you're talking about myth, that's the way that myth works. So Art, let me ask you, did Lindelof's show manage to strike a balance between continuing the Watchmen legacy while creating something entirely of its own?
Are we going straight to spoilers?
Nah, I'd like to hold off on spoilers a little bit here.
Okay, because he lied. That's like Nolan saying there will not be a Robin in The Dark Knight Rises. And then we see the movie and he's like, hey, technically, that was his nickname. I was like, get out of here. I don't know if he was 100% with that right there. And that is one of the qualms that we'll get to later in the spoilers, but...
Yeah.
No. For me, that's a no on that quote right there. Was that before or after the finale?
That was after the finale. I can explain more, but maybe we need to get into spoilers.
Okay, yeah, we'll get into that later. Let's talk about the basics here. I have been reading the comic back. I had read it a few years ago, like almost technically a decade ago. It's kind of crazy to think. What is time?
Right.
I had read it a decade ago, and I loved it. I've been reading it again with all the traveling that I've been doing, and I was like, yo, this is really good. I was only able to finish about 60% of it. Before I was like, I got to start watching the show. And the show does a really good job of catching you up if you don't know anything about the series. Alina's never read... I think Alina read the book along with me 10 years ago, so she hasn't been caught up with it. I know you said you haven't read it in a bit.
Right, so we're coming at this from different perspectives. You being a big fan of the comics, having seen the movie, and
I love the comic.
Knowing the context around the movie.
Yeah.
I've seen the movie, but I didn't read the comics, so to me, Watchmen is just like a distant memory in a way.
Gotcha. The show does a great job if you're a fan, and if you've never seen it, of catching you up and all these little Easter eggs that they do. I know some people aren't the biggest fans of it. We're going to get to that in a bit with the changes that it makes for sure, some of which I don't know about. But as a show, season 1, 9 episodes. They didn't even do the full 10. They pulled an Oscars on us for Best Picture. A fantastic beginning, middle, and end. It's HBO, so we don't know what a miniseries means to them anymore. But whether they do another one, whether they don't, I thought this was a great conclusion. Some people believe the ending is a cliffhanger. I don't see it as a cliffhanger. I see that as the continuation to a complete other story, if what we think happens even happens. Right. great acting. Great. I think you had put this the way you phrase it, so you can complete the sentence. You go into this world, and you know that they could do 2011, 2012. Any year, there is an entire layout to the show, because the way Damon Lindelof works, as Lost being my favorite show, is almost reverse engineering. Mm-hmm. Right? This is a show, HBO's had Westworld, and they've had several other shows dealing with just the way that the narrative is told, where it requires you to see the entire thing before you pass judgments on anything. This is definitely one of those shows where you do your theories week by week, and that's exactly what Zach told me. He's like, I know you like binging it at the end, but this is a show where you got to carry on the theories from episode to episode to episode, and as you've been doing.
It's a show that really benefits from trying to put yourself in the mindset of that world and figuring, like, if this happens, what does that mean?
Yeah.
If people are having if kids are getting into fights because one accuses another's mother of using Redfordations, like, what does that say about Watchmen's culture in relation to our culture?
Exactly. Sometimes I would say it's a little too on the nose, and other times it's just started off simple here, right? It was your second favorite show of the year. I had not ranked it yet. I would say right now it'd probably go somewhere along 8, looking back at my list. I can't remember if I had it towards the end. But now that it's fully completed, I would have it at 8, 7. I really do enjoy it. But there are some things. The fish. For those of you who don't know, the squid. There is an event that happens towards the comics that causes, in this world, it reminds me very Magnolia-like, where squid falls from the sky, but that's a normal occurrence. The same way that Vietnam never happening, the same way that, as you said, Robert Redford being president and doing something called Redfordations, which, there's a lot of parallels.
There's a way that the show kind of just begins in the middle of a thought that I thought was really, really great. You mentioned that the squids fall from the sky. This is a thing that happens, and people in that world just sort of stop their cars and turn their windshield wipers on. You know, they're used to this. The fact that Vietnam's a state isn't strange to people. Yeah. Something that I love is this white supremacist cult, or whatever you want to call it, and it's not mentioned, but they use an American flag with fewer stars on it because they don't recognize Vietnam as truly part of America. And it's that type of deep thinking about the world in which Watchmen exists that I was really stunned by, and made me really excited to spend like 3, 4, 5 seasons with this show. That being said, the way that the first season played out, I do feel like it ended on a note that feels like a finale, feels like the ending of a story. I don't know. I don't know if I need more Watchmen. I feel like it did what it wanted to do and did it excellently. And that's perfect. Yeah, I as much as I loved spending time in that world, I don't see a need for a second season. That being said, there is this narrative going around of like, oh, well, you can't do a second season after this. And I think there's a way that a smart writer who, like the way that Lindelof sat down and figured out a way to do Watchmen in 2019, another person can sit down and figure out how to do Watchmen after the first season of Watchmen.
Yeah, exactly. I agree with you. Until they Big Little Lies it, and then it can't just be a season 2. It's got to be a season 3 or something along with it. I agree with you. All of the details that they put into it. There were some, if I may. Why isn't the windshield wipers already for the squids? Why she even got to get out of the car? There was little things where I was like, if this has been happening since 85, y'all would have found like windshield wipers, or the cars would have been completely different to deal with the squid on the streets or something else on the streets. Do you get what I mean?
Well, there was like a squid cleanup crew that they showed.
They got the cleanup crew, but I was like, y'all don't have windshield wipers for these things already? There's some other stuff when we get to the spoilers, but I really love the lived-in world and just the attention to detail. I ain't even catch the thing with the flag. I was like, oh, okay, that's pretty interesting. There was a lot of callbacks, though, narratively, where you go back after seeing episode 8 or 9, and you go, that was there the whole... They put Easter eggs in dildos. When Zach sent me that there was the one of the biggest plot twists was spoiled to you in episode 2, 3?
3.
Through a dildo?
So do we want to jump into spoilers? Because, I think we are both in agreement that it's a show worth your time, although I may be a little bit more excited about it. But, there's so much to talk about here, and I'd love to be able to talk about it without necessarily holding back. So we're going to go into our spoilers section. If you can't handle the truth or you haven't seen the series, now's your chance to go watch a spoiler-free edition of the Intercut Podcast, including our recently published Best TV of 2019. Who knows? You may get a little bit more Watchmen talk on that episode too. But yeah, I don't know if the thing you want to jump to first is the way that episode 9 ends and everything starts to come together, or if we want to go a little bit deeper on the way that the show uses Hooded Justice.
Let's save Hooded Justice for a little bit, but if you can give an overall view of who the main character would be, because I would say it's definitely King's character, and how she's the center to all of it. I think if you want to give the breakdown to it.
I think, yeah, well, the show does a really interesting job, a really interesting thing in that while it involves a lot of familiar aspects, the first 2 episodes really follow closely the story of Angela Abar, a policewoman living in Tulsa, Oklahoma, who was born in Vietnam. We find out through the course of the show that she has a tragic past in Vietnam, and that her family's legacy has a tragic past in Tulsa, Oklahoma. I thought one of the really brilliant things about this show is the way in which it opens on that 1921 Tulsa massacre, the Black Wall Street massacre.
Real event.
A real event recontextualized to fit within the narrative of the show as being kind of Oklahoma's racist legacy and something that inspires the creation in a way of the first superhero in this universe.
Yep.
The way that Angela Abar ultimately fits within Watchmen, it's intriguing because you don't expect her to at first, but when you start to get the pieces of the show, you see the way that because she's a policewoman and in this society they've decided that policemen need to wear masks. She's become a masked vigilante in ways herself, and her story is a reflection of her grandfather's story. Yeah, I think there's a lot of extremely smart writing when it comes to stuff like that.
He lied in that article that you said. Watchmen babies? She's a Watchmen granddaughter.
That what he's saying there is his first thought is he didn't want to do Watchmen babies. That was within the context of talking about Lady True. So he was acknowledging that ultimately they got to the point where they are. Baby. No, that's what he's saying.
I know.
At first thought he was not going to do Watchmen babies, and because the way that myths work, the story demanded that there were some legacy Watchmen characters.
So he doesn't like The Last Jedi.
Maybe not. Maybe it's his Rian Johnson diss.
So to me, what really ends up happening towards the second half is, and I mean, you could really call it because it stems from the grandfather paradox that happens. And having talked about other HBO shows that are Westerns that recently came out without spoiling too much there, they do a lot of narrative timeline jumping as well. Here, though, there is literal, actual, not time travel, but time bending with the character of Dr. Manhattan, since we're fully into spoilers now. Right. It all becomes
this whole chicken and the egg paradox that comes up in episode 8.
Hey, I'm going to start off right off with giving them a big plus. I love their answer. Very rarely, we always get the cliche, what, chicken or the egg? This man said both. Because I'm living both simultaneously. Just the way that the whole show is structured, from you seeing her, who you think is her confidant. What the heck? He's got a robe, which was hilarious because what's the actor's name who ends up having the robe?
Don Johnson?
Was he not the same guy in Django Unchained who went, I can't see out these damn eye holes?
I don't know if he was.
I'm almost positive it was still him, and that's my favorite line from Django because it makes absolutely no sense. Yet again, another Klan member. He was just in Knives Out. Yet again, someone who also...
Yeah, you're right. It was Don Johnson.
So, again, towards the end of it, when you realize that the entire thing is a ploy, Dr. Manhattan saw Interstellar, and he realized there was love out there, and somehow, call it the Chosen One paradox, the Neo paradox, decides to go with a woman who he's known his entire life. And again, paradoxes can get very tricky because it's like, where's the beginning, the middle, the end? He lives everything simultaneously, and I think the way they approached that was beautiful. The way that it became a love story was beautiful. All the way down to the death. It was a very interesting way of going like, when did you fall in love with me? 10 years from now. I see it all at once. when did you fall in love with me? Or when did we, when it comes 10 years later and he's looking at her and he's like, this is the moment I fell in love with you. He's like, we've been together 10 years and this is when you see
and
it.
And now, I kind of love that
it
dissatisfaction almost that she had there.
Great way. Even his death, right? We've always had the cliche, dying on the... Keeps her, says, before I go, I want to see one last person. I do question the first one, just to be the nitpicker here, and I want your response, so let's go at it. Let's start this jousting right here. I don't know. A little too cliche to be like, out of all the people he could have met, it just so happens to be the person who is the granddaughter of Hooded Justice, who, looks completely different in the comics. I'm just, physique-wise, not look like Will Reeves. And for it to be conveniently a thing where the man who can control everything and see the future finds no alternative way until he does find an alternative way in the 9th episode. How do you see that? Did you ever feel it was a little too convenient, the way that the whole paradox works?
Not really, because I kind of look at it the way, and I can't believe I'm about to make a reference to Marvel, but the Doctor Strange moment.
It was a Doctor Strange moment.
Right? In that, way. Like, the ability that he has to see... I know, I'm a nerd. Let's go for it.
Scorsese's crying right now.
But the way that he's able to see through to the future and the past and experience it all as one,
he knows the one
I kind of figure it's kind of that.
Okay.
It works in that sense, and there is this thing that exists in a lot of literature about the idea of the power of love, and it's a bit intangible and it can be a little bit squishy and hard to define. But like, look, if you sell me on the romance, I'm willing to go with you there. And I really bought that they were in love. I bought that they had this this relationship that tied them together, and he felt attached to her and she grew fond of him, and the tragedy of their promised tragic ending I thought really worked. So I'm able to kind of not think too hard about time paradoxes when you give me a story that kind of moves me on that emotional level.
And both really convince you that they were in love.
Right.
Regina's character likes him because she falls in love with Dr. Manhattan because...
What is it?
I don't know. That's why I'm asking you, because at first when I saw it, I was like, I just don't buy the relationship of a god falling in love, because that was the whole big issue in the comics. He doesn't. This man does not care. In the comics, there's that very famous scene with... she's in this too, the older version of her. The FBI agent who was his girlfriend back in the day.
Silk Spectre, or the second Silk Spectre.
Yeah, the daughter of comedian's daughter as well. There's that very famous scene where there's like 5 of him, and she's like, yo, this is weird. He's like, oh, I'm sorry. He's like, sorry, where are you? And he's working on something else. She's like, you just don't get it, do you? It's like, you need to be here in the moment, and he just couldn't see love at all. So I will, from that perspective, I can kind of buy the fact that he was like,
well, I mean, yeah, but also to I guess to make it simple, I mean, what's not to love about a god? He has all these abilities, and she's so skeptical of him when he first sits down at the bar with him in that episode, and she just ends up being charmed by the end of it. Mm-hmm. I think there's just something to say about his nature and his disposition, and he's played so charismatically by Yahya Abdul-Mateen II. I just think, like, I buy into that relationship. I don't know.
I when seeing Angelica, is that her name, right? Angela, sorry. Angela's whole arc of never being able to have anything like solidified. She goes to Vietnam.
Oh yeah, and she gives him he gives her security.
He gives her security. Alina told me that. He's like, I don't see why she would like him. She should be very cynical about this. And he's like, well, exactly. She's a cynical person who finally has someone who tells her everything. And it isn't until that starts to fall apart, because he decides to become the human that he is, that things start getting rocky. And I was like, all right, that does make sense on her perspective. This is a girl who lost her parents because technically of Dr. Manhattan. This is a girl who then gets rescued by her grandmother, who dies from a heart attack right as she's about to take her back. And then eventually you got this guy who in a sense caused your parents' death a little bit vicariously, who ends up giving you the what's it called? Stability that you never thought you could have because he knows everything until he doesn't. It's just the God factor of it. I feel it's kind of like you've seen The Good Place?
Yeah, of course.
It's still humans writing for angels and how they hate humans. I was like, it was still a human writing it in a sense. I always have that. I know that's more of a nitpick than anything, but it's just always like we try to make these overly God beings very human, I guess is my thing. And I loved that with Ozymandias. I just feel it's the Superman complex, which is what Alan Moore was tackling in the comic, and I feel a lot of people now have the issue over here because in the comic he goes bye and he dips to Mars, and in this one he's like, yeah, but what if love?
Right.
And it's a little bit for me, but I did like it. I like the relationship.
It's also like you don't have a story if he doesn't come back. In
exactly.
The
yeah. I mean, you don't have to do Watchmen, babies.
And he, the thing is with Dr. Manhattan that he does have human in him.
He does have human in him, yeah. And there is a part, the part that I thought he does great as being a fan of Lost, as not finishing Leftovers yet, but the way that he plays with the storylines there, having a dude who can be at that moment of fear. That line, when was the last time you felt fear? Right now.
Right, yeah.
That's wild. When was the last time you fell in love with me? Right now. It's also the first time I met you. It's also the time I'm dying. It's everything at once. And I was like, that's an interesting character.
The ways in which Lindelof is able to play with time, I think,
it was clever.
Are really clever, and they work on a very emotional level too. You think back to the way in which he would do the same thing on Lost, how he'd have a flashback that resonated with what's happening in the present, and he's very good at doing this type of thing.
He does a great job between 6 and 8. Episode 6 being, go ahead. Because I know that was one of your favorite episodes of the year.
This Extraordinary Being, probably one of the best episodes of television this year, if not the best episode. And I would say far and away the standout episode of this season. Mm-hmm. I think you'd agree with me.
Yes.
The kind of backstory of the Hooded Justice character, in which we kind of get this vision of how it came to be, in which a culture could whitewash the idea of a superhero, in which Will Reeves hides his identity in order to not
light around the eyes and
fear, invoke fear and be inspiring. It's a thing that cements Watchmen in a world we're familiar with, taking on that weight of that racial complex, but it does it in a way that doesn't feel hokey and feels, like it belongs in the timeline that we're familiar with.
It does. That was the craziest thing, is finding, and we've seen this so many times with people wanting to go back in prequels and trying to answer something. We've seen it through Star Wars. We've seen it in all of our superheroes as well. They'll go back and be like, what if we answered that question? Do you realize answering that question causes a lot of other things going on? Here, because you got the comic, you got the graphic novel, and you got this, they found a way to address a lot of things. The only nitpick being what I was telling you, the stature of the Hooded Justice in the comic is almost like of a Ringling Brothers type person. And they answer it in here because in the comic they go, he went missing. But everyone believes that he's also the other guy who they found dead. And they address him a little bit, I want to say in the series. Besides the stature not lining up, that was a solid-ass story. It was dope.
So to me, and I understand maybe my opinion is a little bit skewed by not having that history with the comics that you do, but the fact that he isn't this muscular guy and he isn't this white guy as he's depicted in that Watchmen show within the show, which I want to talk about that more in a little bit too.
Dude, American Hero Story?
Yes.
Hilarious.
But I think you could include the idea of his stature being of this big jacked guy as part of this way in which culture has sort of made it like a revisionist history, right? Yeah. The way in which you look at all these aspects of culture that were started by black people, like different styles of music from rock and roll to jazz, and then adopted by white artists or white faces, and ultimately taken to a new level. I think you could include the depiction of Hooded Justice in that idea of this is the story America decided to tell itself about Hooded Justice, not what actually he looked like and actually his build was like.
I agree with you. Granted, it's actual full scenes in the comics where you do see his build like that. But I agree with you. No. I love the retconning, if we want to call it that, because this is the issue that a lot of people are having problems with. And there was a whole big uproar. And that's the only one where it'd be like, okay, I mean, just off of the stature, sure. If we're talking Rorschach, bro, having reread the comic, people are like, how could you make Rorschach racist? Have y'all read the comic? This man has lines up to... He goes, well, if that guy's a Nazi, I might as well be one too. That is his literal line in the comics as well. He talks about homosexuals and all of the scum on the streets. He's practically walking around like he's taxi driver, talking about how he wants to clean the streets and stuff. So I thought that was a genius way of transitioning what would be a symbol that used to be one of the superheroes, one of the Minutemen, or not necessarily the Minutemen, one of the Watchmen, that then transitions into being this massive cult that they have behind the scenes.
Yeah, that's one of the amazing things I think about this Watchmen show is the way in which it's able to incorporate certain iconography that we know from the original Watchmen. That Rorschach mask is maybe one of the most famous images we have from Watchmen.
Yeah.
And kind of reintegrate it, not necessarily losing the ties to the original, but making it new. The way in which all of the Night Owl gear had become adopted by the different policemen.
Yes, which I also thought was such an interesting thing, like you said, where something that swapping the roles right at the beginning. Now it's a black cop pulling over a white person, and it's the one who's... There was a quote in the... maybe you can quote it a little bit better than me, that when a white man wears a hood, he's a hero, but a black man wears a white man wears a mask, he's a hero. Lone Ranger, Batman, all of that. Black man wears a mask, he's a criminal. Right. And that reversal and seeing it... I do think he was way too on the nose sometimes. And it's not that the original comic didn't do that, but there is some times where he's very on the nose. And I do wonder if a person of color would have written or directed, if there would be a little bit more subtlety.
Yeah, I do know that they had some people of color in the writer's room, and I think they had a black writer on one or two of the scripts during the season.
And I say this...
But yeah, it is... coming from Lindelof, and I think it's been interesting to listen to him talk about how he feels there are ways in which this is totally not his story to tell. He said that in interviews.
He said that? All right, just making sure, because there was some points where I was like, I don't know how much... I mean, he's doing a good job approaching it.
Yeah.
But I don't know if he's got like what a Jordan Peele would have in what he did with Get Out and stuff. And to be surprisingly, it does not come from any of the Will Reeves. It doesn't come from Angela's... None of that. To me, it actually come from whenever you had the white supremacists going, it's a hard time for America if you're white.
Right.
I was that's very on the nose.
I think they did the thing where they gave the villain speech, and there's no villain speech that really sounds right.
Right.
I do think that maybe in that 9th episode they had to do a little bit of like tying things up and giving everything its due in a way that maybe felt a little bit TV exposition-y. I think, for example, that interaction that Veidt had with the newspaper man was like kind of a pure fan service in a way that I didn't need.
Yes, well, having read the comics, I was telling you before this as well, that dude is the same exact, not the same exact guy, but he resembles a lot. There's a whole issue where a guy is sending comics, and it's a very funny bit, because there's always a dude who says the end is nigh, and he goes, you need your newspaper today? He's like, yeah, I'll see you tomorrow, even though the world is ending today. The world is always ending, and he's like, oh, is it ending today? Yeah. All right, see you tomorrow. All right, see you tomorrow. What does the scene end with? Ozzy saying the end is nigh. So I thought that was a nice little callback. And I agree with you. I didn't mind those too much, but I feel you the same way. A lot of it feels like, I wouldn't call it filler, but definitely callbacks to stuff. Some things were a little, Snyder did his version of Watchmen. Snyder tends to do a lot of religious metaphors. I have never in my life seen the ending. Ooh. The phrase... okay, I'm not a fan of it.
The split diopter.
I'm not a fan of that one. And I have been jotting down every diopter shot since earlier this year when us decided to do a whole scene with it. Having Jesus up in the back, and then her, when the fish comes down, the squid comes down, and gets pierced. I'm like, okay, that's a little too on the nose there. No. My man said that the squid was supposed to be like an artillery gun. I ain't see no bullet holes other than her hand. That thing goes through her hand, but it doesn't go through the little doesn't go through the telephone booth, doesn't go through the cars. That's where I started thinking the biggest criticism I've heard of the finale is that it's too optimistic. After all of the dark history and the way that the book ends, that it's so optimistic. The bad guy gets arrested. Ozzy goes to jail. Our heroes are still alive. All the kids are good. Justice, justice, justice. It almost kind of stripped away from that Watchmen-esque thing. Watchmen was saying it's not your other superhero comic. This is the real world.
I hear that interpretation, but I think it's balanced out by the death of the one super being that we have, Dr. Manhattan,
Fair.
like in a too pure for this world kind of sense that
He could have done more. I agree.
But like in this pursuit of power that man has, in this in the way that the senator is not content just being president. He wants to be a god. Lady True is not content just being the smartest woman in the world. She wants to be God. Like, because humans have this desire for more than they already have, we lose some things that are precious. And I think that's ultimately what Watchmen is kind of telling us by the end. Even though a lot of the story ends up in a good place, there is that balancing thing to the universe. So yeah, I mean, while I don't know if ultimately the 7th Cavalry amounted to much, I was much more intrigued by them, and they did a thing with the Looking Glass episode where you think for a moment maybe they're not bad guys, and then they kind of just fall off for the last few episodes as the show gets a little bit more internally looking, and almost a little bit more about the Watchmen characters, giving that episode 6 is about Hooded Justice, episode 7
exactly
is the lead into the Manhattan episode.
For the first 5, having the only big one be Ozymandias being like the only one who's up there, I was like, oh, okay, that's kind of cool. It's like you gotta at least keep one, and then like you said, 6 comes around, it's like now the whole bunch coming back, and granddaughters and whatever else. I did like what I was saying earlier, how 6 and 8, narratively, right? Just putting the lore to the side, just the technical aspects of it. I loved how 6 prepped you for 8. In 6, they go, all right, here's this pill that's going to cause different things to happen. And now the character is literally seeing the edit to Watchmen Season 1, Episode 6. The way that it's flashing in her brain is exactly what we're seeing, and I thought that was a very genius way of putting you into the shoes of it. Just like Cal later on at the ending of Episode 7, where he goes, it was before my, I really don't know what's going on, and you're sitting there experiencing it for the first time going, is she about it? She just killed her husband? That's a very good moment to put you into it, when you realize Ozymandias' statue that was sitting there the entire time, from Angela's perspective, was just a statue. I didn't know it was him cryogenically frozen.
The show had a lot of hidden in plain sight twists that are so exciting, and speaks to how good of a TV writer, how good of a writer of episodic television Lindelof and his crew are. Something that I really loved about this season is the way that it felt like a collection of short stories, in that, episode 3 reintroduces us to Laurie Blake and how she's, has all these conversations with a god who won't answer. Episode 5 gives us the history of the Tim Blake Nelson character, and what's the deal with Looking Glass, and why does he wear all that reflectitine. The segmented nature, the way that we delve into different people's histories, similarly to how Lindelof approached both Lost and Leftovers, is something that I loved when combined with a world as rich as the one they created here.
It was a nice cheat code too, because then by 8 he is able to show you something and then just randomly cut to a flashback. Like someone puts a hood over and he just cuts the flashback, because there's still side effects to the nostalgia. I was like, that's good. That's good. Yeah. You literally found a cheat code to be able to be like, if only I could just cut to something, but I don't want to be too on the nose. Side effects. And then it's perfect, because we've been adjusted for episodes 6 and 7 to have that type of editing. And then we meet in episode 8 a dude who literally is living every timeline, and the perfect way to showcase this character would be in a visual medium where you can cut from where he's at the moment to something else. And I was like, that's very clever. The whole entire time he was prepping you for that type of storytelling. I was like, that's pretty good. It's almost like he's been here a while. It's almost like he's written things before. The ending you were talking about, I believe it was the prophet Kanye West who had said, no one man should have all that power. Does she? My man was whooping up waffles like it was donkey. He was like, in the morning I'm making waffles, but one of them was a special little egg that would have given her all of the powers that Dr. Manhattan is able to transfer to somebody else. She takes it. Does she walk on water? Does she not? Does it matter?
Yeah. I mean, I love the show ending where it does before we really have an answer to it, because I think that ambiguity is a much more interesting question. And to me, I have an interpretation of it that I discovered is different than Damon Lindelof's interpretation of it, because in that interview that I mentioned with Angelica Jade Bastion, he does say that he thinks she walks on the water, which is a strange conclusion, I think, given as we were talking about before we started recording, the words of Veidt earlier in this episode. That being said, I think Angela is a very different character than Lady True, in that Angela comes with all this tragedy around her, having not only lived through it but experienced generations of it through her taking of the nostalgia. And I wonder, as almost if any of it was a promise to the Will Reeves character.
A little bit. I would say that because, I mean, he would not have left it for her. Like, I had just assumed the moment that Will Reeves says he left you something, the egg thing, and I go, that's the waffles. So then she goes back, and I'm just waiting for her to pick up the waffle box, or not the waffle, but the eggs that she herself had dropped. Because at the same time, the previous episode, why was this man eating waffles? It clearly
but there's also
had to something.
That last note that Will ends on mentioning he could have done more, you know?
And I agree 100% with that. And like Ozzy had said, my daughter, anyone who wants to be God that bad will not be. It's going to do something else completely with it.
Right.
So if she does have powers, what are your predictions for season 2? What you would like to see for season 2? I personally believe they're all lying and they already have season 2 written.
I mean, Lindelof swears he's done with this, although Regina King has suggested she's not.
Oh, Regina King wants to do this for the rest of her life. Like, you have to understand, this was the first role she took after the Oscar.
Right.
Like, the only other person I'm very curious to see what to take next is, what's her name from 3 Billboards? Because Frances has not taken anything. Like, she's like, nope, no. She has said no so many times, but this was Regina's, like, first big thing that she wanted to do.
Isn't she doing Chloe Zhao's new movie?
Who?
I think Frances is doing Chloe Zhao's new movie. Is she really? Yeah.
Ooh. Who would you like to see in season 2, though?
Ooh, I mean, that's a hard question. You know, Hong Chow is one of our favorites, so I was really excited when she showed up here, and she's so great here on this season.
As she is on Homecoming, which we mentioned before. Definitely go catch that show. Amazon Prime.
Yeah, but looking ahead to season 2, I mean, I don't even know who I would consider as
even just storyline wise, because say she does take it, it works. Right. She now has this massive responsibility unless it's proven, which seems to be the cycle, that of course she's not going to be able to handle all that power. You have no story.
I think that ultimately it's going to have to pull a bit of a time gap or movement gap. I think what season 2 would be something that's not set in Tulsa and probably about something very different. In order for it to work. But, that's maybe too big of a question to answer.
Like an anthology almost. Like have
without
Watchmen,
really thinking it through,
Yeah. So having like the second one just take place in a completely different place that doesn't really have to do with what's going on there.
Yeah.
All right.
Or put Zendaya in it. I like Zendaya.
Hey, there you go. It's just a whole Euphoria episode. So who's your favorite character out of the bunch here?
Yeah, I think it was a pretty stacked cast from top to bottom. I mean, even Louis Gossett Jr. In the Will Reeves role was great. I don't know.
For me personally, I really liked Ozymandias' character. Or Ozymandias, I know people say it differently. That whole concept of him thinking he was going to go to his utopia, only to realize he was sent to his utopia just to be tortured, and that whole concept
slowly
of
going insane.
Yeah, just the whole back and forth that he had with the Adam and Eves there, if that's what you want to call them, and he just abused them because he was just like, you guys just don't get it. All the way up to that last one where he put the mask on, saying that when you put a mask on a man, it makes him cruel. And he still even kills that guy. But all the way to the end of him actually breaking himself and saying, "I'll never call you daughter." Man wrote it on the moon. I would say, and I do like Angela's character. I still, we had mentioned in one of the previous intercuts how it's become one of the most badass characters who they don't want you to dress up as. King's gone on record saying, "Please do not dress up like my character. That's not the purpose of it." But it's also Rorschach. I knew so many people in high school who used to do the Rorschach masks.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that's got a little bit of a. Would you be walking around like this?
Right.
That's a little bit of a switch that's happened there, but I'm very curious to see what else they do because there's still a lot of other characters that they covered within the comics. One of the most intriguing ones to me was this guy named Dollar Bill. I think was his name, or Mighty Bill or something. It was how the concept became that so many people wanted their own superhero that it became marketable. Banks, don't go to the other bank. We have our own superhero, Mighty Bill, or whatever his name was, right? And he was the one who was protecting that bank so your money was safe. But in order to market him, they wanted to give him a cape. And that cape got stuck in the turnstile for the door. He got shot in the head. And that's how he died. So there's so many, see, that's just and that is told in an excerpt of a book that Night Owl was writing in the comic. I would love to see little stories like that. I would love to see, if the next one wasn't even a complete season, but anthology episodes of different things that are happening within the world. I would love to see an episode of the son, who right at the end sees the costume and has a completely different view of his mom, of his guardian. Yeah. I don't know. There's a lot more to explore. And while
the secret identity of Lube Man.
Yeah, I would love to see what happens next there. I would love to see Ozymandias actually go on trial.
Do you have a theory for Lube Man? Because I feel like the internet's figured out that it's Petey.
Really?
Yeah. I mean, if you read some of the Peteypedia updates, which is another cool thing that they've been doing, is giving you some context online in this website they call Peteypedia.
I've seen excerpts. Is that where it comes from? Some people were saying it's you won't find this in the show. You got to find this elsewhere. And I'm a sucker for ARG with the Cloverfields and stuff. So I still got a lot more research to do on this one. But yeah.
He has a way of observing a lot of stuff that is reminiscent of the way that Lube Man is there just kind of observing. And his disappearance at the end, similar to Petey's disappearance. I don't know.
Interesting.
Any other little things that you liked or wanted to talk about when regarding to Watchmen?
Not so much, but I will say one of my favorite scenes with Blake, it reminded me very much of Get Out, was we were talking about the speeches from the bad guys being a little too over the top. I really liked the trap door. I love that scene so much because it doesn't work at first. Right. That was the perfect balance of tone between the goofiness and that's the speech I want to see, not the it's been a long, hard time for white in America. And whatever speech he was giving, I was like, this is way too on the nose for me personally. But that scene where she was like, all right, you're just going on and on. Yeah. Blooped her down. That I thought was hilarious. But yeah, no, overall I thought it's a very engaging show that narratively just sucks you in because every episode that you see, it's that rabbit hole. It's the JJ mystery box type thing where it just makes you want to know more and more about what's happening. But I really do need to rewatch it because you've seen it a total of 3 times, I want to say. So you've been
2.5. So
you've been able to pick up on things that I have yet to go back and rewatch. Because again, there's some of the things that you don't even have clues for. You literally will not know that is him in the statue until you see episode 9. So I can't even imagine how many other things. Like you said about the loop thing, I haven't even reconsidered that at all.
Right. Yeah, the show really does reward paying close attention. There's that moment early on where you see 7th Cavalry members disassembling watches to get the lithium batteries, and that doesn't really come back until the 9th episode. And, I think when you can see all those little things and know the context, it's going to be that much more rewarding of a show to watch. We've already talked about how brilliant that 6th episode is. I'm not familiar with the Watchmen comics, but I've been watching a lot of the Screen Crush videos, and a lot of other different companies have been posting all the Easter eggs and just all the little things they do, whether that's the way that Looking Glass picks his mask up and eats beans from a can the same way that Rorschach did. And it's stuff like that that's so fun and clever and makes me really in awe of how the show works, both as a way of continuing this intellectual property and creating something new, bringing in all these elements from reality, and having the show really be about something, have actual things to say about how we feel about race in America and our responsibilities towards crimes of the past.
Mm-hmm.
I think the way that it's about something and made us focus on an incident that a lot of people didn't know about, the 1921 massacre. I really am impressed that Lindelof would go to such lengths and do it in a way that felt like it did it justice.
I agree. It did exactly what Alan Moore was trying to do with the graphic novel itself. I'm just very curious to see if he ever watches it and what he thinks about it, knowing what Alan Moore feels about adaptations.
I am not going to hold my breath for a response from Alan Moore.
But here we did like it. I know it was your favorite of the year, and I highly recommend it.
That is Succession.
Yeah. So
go watch Succession too.
Go get an HBO subscription is really what this sounds like over here.
Euphoria, High Maintenance.
Barry. It's too much.
Yeah. So that's all for this edition of Let Us Explain on Intercut. You can catch more from me, Zach Shevich, by following me on Twitter, Instagram, or Letterboxd @ZShevich, or check out my YouTube channel, youtube.com/multiplexshow. Art, where can people find more from you?
You can find me at The A to Z Show. Let Me Explain on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube, I think I said. Or you just find me here every single week on the Intercut Podcast.
You can listen to every episode of the Intercut Podcast on iTunes, SoundCloud, Spotify, or Overcast. And then, once you've subscribed to the audio feed, subscribe to the video feed on youtube.com/multiplexshow, where you can catch our bright, smiling faces as we break down the latest entertainment for you. You can find new episodes of Intercut every Friday. Please leave us a comment, like the video, consider heading over to iTunes to give us a 5-star review, and like our Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter pages. All of them are at Intercut Pod to get updates throughout the week from Art, from me, from all of our guests here on Intercut. Thanks again for tuning in, and until next time, nothing ever ends.